Cerebral white matter is a compact mass of vast number of nerve fibers and associated neuroglia. It lies deep in the cerebral cortex and connects the various parts with one another. It also connects the other parts of the CNS. The white matter forms a large volume of each cerebral hemisphere. There are three types of white matters, and they are association fibers, commissural fibers, and projection fibers. Association fibers, also called as intrahemispheric fibers, and the types are short association fibers and long association fibers. Short association fibers connects adjacent gyri by hooking around the sulcus. They are also called as arcuate fibers. Long association fibers, these fibers travel long distances and interconnect gyri of different lobes. They are usually grouped as bundles.
The types of long association fibers are uncinate fasciculus, superior longitudinal bundle, inferior longitudinal bundle, cingulum, and fronto-occipital bundle. Commissural fibers. They are also called interhemispheric fibers because they connect identical or corresponding fibers of the two hemispheres. These groups of bundles are called commissures.
And the types are corpus callosum, anterior commissure, posterior commissure, hippocampal commissure, and habenular commissure. Projection fibers. These fibers connect cerebral cortex to subcortical centers and spinal cord.
Most important projection fibers are internal capsule, corona radiata, fornix, and fimbriae. The corpus callosum.
It is the largest commissure of the brain, connecting the right and left hemispheres. In the sagittal section of the cerebrum, it is seen as a C-shaped mass of white fibers on the medial surface of the cerebral hemisphere. It is 10 centimeters long. The corpus callosum is divided into 4 parts: genu, rostrum, splenium, and the trunk.
Genu.
It is the thick curved anterior extremity of the corpus callosum and lies 4 centimeters behind the frontal pole.
Rostrum.
It is the thin downward and backward extension of the genu that joins the lamina terminalis.
Splenium.
It is the massive posterior extremity, lying 6 centimeters in front of the frontal pole.
Trunk.
It is the middle part of the corpus callosum, lying between the genu and the splenium.
Forceps minor.
It is a fork-like structure formed by the fibers of genu curving forward on either side into the anterior parts of the frontal lobes.
Forceps major.
It is a fork-like structure formed by the fibers that connect the occipital lobes curving backwards on either side above the calcarine sulcus.
Tapetum.
It is the thin lamina of white fibers formed by those fibers of the trunk and splenium which are not intersected by the fibers of the corona radiata.
Blood supply.
Pericallosal artery, a branch of the anterior cerebral artery. Posterior pericallosal artery, a branch of the posterior cerebral artery. Median callosal artery or subcallosal artery, a branch of the anterior communicating artery.
Internal capsule. The internal capsule is one of the most important and compact bundle of projection fibers in the white matter of the cerebrum. So the shape. In a horizontal section of the cerebral hemisphere, the internal capsule appears as a V-shaped compact bundle of white fibers with its concavity directed laterally. Now coming to the boundaries, it is bounded medially by the caudate nucleus and the thalamus. Laterally, it is bounded by the lentiform nucleus. Superiorly, the fibers radiate to form corona radiata and condense caudally as the crus cerebri of the midbrain. The parts of the internal capsule include 5 parts, that is the anterior limb, posterior limb, and the anterior limb and the posterior limb are joined by a curved part that is known as the genu. The retrolentiform part, which is behind the lentiform nucleus and the sublentiform part which lies below the lentiform nucleus. The fibers of the internal capsule are majorly divided into motor fibers or descending fibers and sensory fibers or ascending fibers. The motor fibers are again divided into corticopontine fibers, pyramidal fibers, and extrapyramidal fibers. The corticopontine fibers divided into frontopontine, peridopontine, temporopontine, and occipitopontine fibers. The frontopontine fibers are most numerous and pass through the anterior limb, the genu, and the posterior limb. The peridopontine and the occipitopontine fibers pass through the lentiform part of the internal capsule. The temporopontine fibers pass through the sublentiform part of the internal capsule. Corticopontine fibers relay in the ipsilateral pontine nuclei. They cross the midline to relay in the opposite cerebellar hemisphere. So this forms the corticopontocerebellar pathway. Now the pyramidal fibers. The pyramidal fibers arise in the cerebral cortex and relay in the lower motor neurons within the brainstem and the spinal cord. These are divided into corticonuclear fibers and corticospinal fibers. The corticonuclear fibers occupy the genu of the internal capsule, whereas the corticospinal fibers occupy the posterior limb of the internal capsule. Extrapyramidal fibers occupy the posterior limb near the corticospinal fibers. Now, the sensory fibers. The sensory fibers are mostly thalamocortical fibers which radiate from the thalamus in different directions to form the thalamic radiation. The other fibers are corticothalamic fibers. The thalamic radiation is divided into anterior thalamic radiation. This anterior thalamic radiation connects the anterior and dorsomedian nucleus of thalamus to the frontal lobe cortex. The second, superior thalamic radiation. It is directed superiorly and passes through the anterior limb of the internal capsule. Next, the posterior thalamic radiation. The fibers pass through the laterolentiform part of the internal capsule. Connects the lateral geniculate body to the primary visual cortex to form the optic radiation. The inferior thalamic radiation. The fibers pass through the sublentiform part of the internal capsule. It connects the medial geniculate body with the primary auditory area to form the auditory radiation. Now, the arterial supply of the internal capsule. So, the internal capsule is supplied by a large number of arteries. They include the medial and lateral striate branches of the middle cerebral artery. Next, the striate branches of the anterior cerebral artery, the central branches of the anterior choroidal artery, some direct branches from the internal carotid artery, central branches of the posterior communicating artery, and the posterolateral central branches of the posterior cerebral artery.